In the remaining time, I'd like to go to each one of you with perhaps a 2-minute question answer segment that looks at a subset of what is part of this foreign policy. Max, I've recently seen some comments from you on Ukraine policy. The president, as you note, was, shifted us to pro-Russia, then has been frustrated by Putin, somewhat miraculously discovering what all the world knew, that Putin was not a reliable actor. Cutting off arms, saying he had nothing to do with that, restoring some arms flows, but only defensive arms and less than he had promised before. Net, do you feel Russia is a net beneficiary of Trump-Ukraine policy?
I mean, so far, yes, because if you just think about what would have happened if, Kamala Harris had been president right now, I think it's probable we would have had another major U.S. Weapons package for Ukraine, which is something we have not had in more than a year. And the last one, which was passed last spring, is rapidly dwindling, even though there's still some weapons in the pipeline, including the ones that Trump resumed shipping this week. So clearly, I think if you had President Harris in office, she would be coordinating much more closely with the Europeans and ratcheting up the pressure on Russia. And I mean, another example of where Trump is failing to hold Russia's feet to the fire is on the issue of sanctions. He has not imposed any new sanctions on Russia since coming to office, which means that the existing sanctions are eroding because, Russia and its foreign partners are constantly finding new ways around the sanctions. And you got to keep sanctioning new companies and targeting new deals if you want to prevent these sanctions from eroding. But Trump is not doing that. And so the sanctions are, in fact, eroding. Now, I think that there is, at least rhetorically, Trump is signaling an unexpected degree of frustration with Putin because he came into office with these ridiculous notions that, he could end the war in a day and Putin would be his buddy and Putin wants to end the war. I mean, I don't know where he got any of these ideas from, but now he is being somewhat disabused of those illusions. And he's understanding that, as he said in the cabinet meeting so eloquently, what Putin is saying is bullshit. Well, yes, it is. I'm glad you noticed what everybody else knew from the beginning. But now the question is, what is Trump going to do about it? And, certainly allowing a small pittance of U.S. aid to flow is a good start, but it's not enough. What he needs to do is push for a new weapons package through Congress. And the other thing he needs to do urgently is to release the frozen Russian funds in the West to Ukraine. And my understanding is that the amount of frozen Russian money in the United States is much higher than we realized, as much as it could be as much as $50 billion. That is a ton of money. If Trump takes $50 billion in Russian money and gives it to Kiev, that is going to fund the Ukrainian war effort for, at least a year, probably more to come. And that will be a massive blow to Russia. And that will make Putin think like, gosh, maybe I can't wait out Zelensky. Maybe I actually need to compromise and make a deal, because right now there's nothing that Trump has done that leads Putin to negotiate in any way seriously. Instead, Putin is ramping up his offensive. And, Trump keeps claiming that Putin would have never invaded Russia if Trump had been president. But in fact, just since Trump has come back into office, Putin has radically ramped up his air attacks on Ukraine, targeting Ukrainian cities. And he hasn't shown any evidence that he's afraid of Trump. Trump needs to put a little fear into Putin. Otherwise, this war will continue to rage out of control.
Yeah, I hate to be a pedant about this, although I don't really. I like to be a pedant.
You love it. You love it.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. No, I do. Putin invaded Ukraine in 2014, and every moment of Trump's first term was waging war against Ukraine. And Trump always says he wouldn't have done it. He did it every moment of his first term in office. And it's a particular bugaboo of mine. Ed, we've talked a little bit about the tariffs here. And, I find it strange, considering how much we've talked about it and how much it's in the news and how much the markets have sort of said what they think about it, and how clear it is what experts think about it, that the tariff policy becomes more incoherent every day, that it is less and less likely. We have less and less idea of how this all is going to pan out. But that's just, for, people like me from New Jersey. You work for the Financial Times, and so you must know how it's all going to turn out. And that's what I'd like to know.
I think one thing's very clear is that not just every country, but every company that does any kind of sort of international operations is now incorporating geopolitical risk and political risk into its ordinary reporting. This used to be, something they'd invite somebody like one of us every, annual general meeting to talk about foreign policy, and just so that they keep their senior leadership abreast. Now this is something that's, scenario planning. Will it end up being 140% on China, 30% on China, 50%? I was like, the differences between these are huge. Access to critical minerals. Where is that going to come from? Will China retain a stranglehold? Will the global supply chain be hit by, Strait of Hormuz or Suez Canal, whatever it might be? This is now part and parcel of their daily perspective. And Trump has rocket boosted just the political noise and risk and uncertainty around doing business. And that's a cost on everybody. It's a tax on everybody. So I don't know specifically where the Trump kabuki deals will end up and how long they'll end up being stuck to. But what we're seeing sort of more deeply, to go back to that tectonic, overused, tired tectonic analogy, is we're seeing the fracturing of the globalized economy. We're seeing a lot of sort of decouplings going on. I mean, not just the Europe decoupling from Russian energy that we've seen since 2022, or US decoupling with China over high-end semiconductors and AI processors, but also things we didn't anticipate. The EU-US defense sectors are beginning a big decoupling, which is very significant. Because although Europe's saying we're going to spend more on defense, they're not saying we're going to spend it on American weapons systems. They are looking to develop their own and buy elsewhere on the global market. That is really significant. There's sort of cross-dressing going on, if you like. I mean, it used to be that China's interest in Africa was in its critical minerals and other commodities. And that's still primarily China's interest in Africa. But our criticism was always they're really the blood diamond power in this great game, and we're the responsible actor in the West. Now they're kind of swapping roles there, because China is saying, right, we're going to have complete tariff-free access for all African goods to China. Not just commodities, but anything you make, anything you manufacture, zero tariff access. Whereas the US under Trump is just after critical minerals. It just wants to get those critical minerals to balance against. These are really significant things happening that will be impervious to whatever levels of tariff levels Trump ends up agreeing on these supposed 90 deals. I don't believe they're going to happen. And I believe if there is one consistency to Trump, is that he sees these deals as grift opportunities. He doesn't want to end the global tariff war, because this is a tool of extraordinary personal enrichment, not just for him, but for people in his family and for people in the families of people who work for him. I mean, there's a whole grift machine. So I don't expect his trade war to end whilst he's president. But I do expect deglobalization to continue. People are hedging. They're now prioritizing resilience over efficiency, which is another way of saying deglobalizing. And that will cost us all.
Yeah. By the way, all these rare earth deals are complete bullshit. First of all, some of them are, like in Ukraine, they don't even know if the rare earths are there. But secondly, the amount of time it would take to identify them, get in there, invest the money in getting them out. And so it takes us decades into it's just nonsense.
But Rosa, money changes hands now, right? I mean, this is the thing. Yeah, Trump doesn't care about that.
Yeah, well, no, I agree with you. I agree with you completely. Rosa, one of my criticisms of Biden foreign policy was that they failed to. They were very concerned about the risk of Russians responding in a nuclear way in Ukraine and so forth. But they completely failed to do political risk analysis of what would happen in the U.S. if we had a major political shift, and we're unable to continue to support Ukraine. And so the last question here is: it sounds to me from all of this like the big X factor and the biggest political risk factor for the world is the U.S., and that within that, U.S. foreign policy is a part of it. But U.S. domestic policy is a big part of it. If we go completely authoritarian and so forth, that's a big risk. Do you agree? And maybe elaborate.
I was just at a conference and I was on a panel and I was asked, what do you see as for an international security perspective, what's the greatest threat to the United States today? And I said the United States is the greatest threat to the United States today, as well as to global stability. And part of that is our domestic policy. When other states see that we like to say authoritarian slide, but this is not a slide. We are tumbling precipitously towards authoritarianism and dramatically increasing the risk of political conflict. I don't think we're going to have some kind of civil war, but I do think that the risk of just sort of more generalized chaos and rising political violence is going up and up. And as the level of open graft and corruption, as we've been discussing, goes up and up, that too imposes costs on the global community, and it imposes costs on us. I mean, our domestic policies absolutely risk. And I also agree with you very much, David, as you know, that I think we can fault the Biden administration for really not wanting to think about this. I mean, on one level, it's not that useful to complain about the Biden administration right now. They're not in power. So, it's sort of backwards looking. And it's of a piece with the failure to really grapple with the fact that Biden himself no longer had the ability to continue to serve or to be the candidate for the party. But a sort of refusal to accept reality that also extended to, we're not interested in trying to plan now to try to lock in as much as we can just in case Trump wins, because they just assumed that Trump was not going to win. And that's the old, hope is not a strategy, but it wasn't even hope. It was just a sort of complacency, I think, that prevented essential planning. And indeed, as you know, I would go back even further and say I fault both the Biden and the Obama administration before it for continuing and enjoying the use of some of the very unconstrained emergency presidential and executive branch powers that we now see Trump abusing in egregious ways because it was convenient for them, and responding to critics by saying, oh, no, don't worry, we have good policies in place within the executive branch to prevent mistake and abuse and so forth, which was, of course, completely missing the point. The point being that you are creating sets of precedents and expanding precedents that if some president comes in who is not so nice and doesn't feel like having internal policy checks to prevent abuse, that these are very, very dangerous. And both Obama and the Biden administration really ignored those because it was just inconvenient to have to deal with it.